Domains. Jujutsu Kaisen's most unique and powerful techniques within its power system. This ability a lot of the time will make or break sorcerer battles and often acts as a last stand, a counter-offensive, or a final blow in a fight in JJK. All the while, there's actually a decent amount of misinterpretation and confusion when it comes to how certain context and wording is used when describing domain combat. So today I wanted to once again revisit domains and explain in detail how they are used and what each type of domain is. Looking back at some of my older videos and explanations, there's actually a decent amount that I got wrong or failed to explain, so I hope that today in this video I will debunk a lot of misconceptions about domain expansion and a lot of things that we see in the series. Of course, this type of information is always susceptible to change, and this video was made with information up to chapter 221. But let's discuss the brilliant system that is domains in Jujutsu Kaisen. A domain could be described as a barrier technique that comes in many shapes and sizes. In essence, anyone who has enough cursed energy can learn to use barrier techniques, but it is very difficult as different sorcerers or users would differ in their range of capability. A person has to start from scratch, add empowered words, and then activate it with cursed energy. In most cases, a barrier uses a perimeter or even constructs tangible shell-like walls, but this distinction varies throughout the series. As we will see today, there are many factors that constitute a domain. In total, there are 5 types of offensive or defensive barrier techniques and anti-domain countermeasures. This is not including curtains. And in this video, we will be debunking all 5 specific types of abilities and each of their respective subcategories, along with certain special exceptions or examples. So let's look into each one, shall we? Starting off, we have simple domains. And these are among the most varied, but surprisingly, they have less users than even domain expansion, as there are 11 users of simple domain in all of its variants. A simple domain comes in many forms, as Gege has made it a very clear point to distinctively emphasize not all domains are the same or that they do the same thing. During the height of the Heian era, at sorcery's peak, a sorcerer named Sadatsuna Ashiya created a technique to protect his disciples and protect oneself from the effects of a domain expansion, and this was known as a domain for the weak. The result is a technique called New Shadow Style Simple Domain. Now, it's important to remember that New Shadow Style is a different variation than that of Simple Domain, as we have examples of techniques like Hollow Wicker Basket and other specialized barriers like Mio's Simple Domain and the Kuchisake Ana's Curse Simple Domain. The first type is the more popular version of the New Shadow Style that was created by Ashiya Sadatsuna and its predecessor, Hollow Wicker Basket. These two abilities basically do the same thing, though they have different hand seals and activations. New Shadow Style and Hollow Wicker Basket are techniques that cancel an opponent's sure hit effect inside a domain expansion. So if an enemy uses domain expansion, the user can deploy New Shadow Style Hollow Wicker Basket to negate the barriers imbued with a curse technique and nullify the guaranteed hit effect. It is explicitly said these techniques do not neutralize curse techniques themselves, but they just void the sure hit effect so the user remains safe, although we will get into some specifics regarding this statement later on. Hollow Wicker Basket is straightforward enough, as there's nothing really to suggest it does anything different than how New Shadow Style Simple Domain is used in terms of negating a domain expansion sure hit. But New Shadow Style has been shown through a couple of applications to do more than just defense. Users like Miwa and Kusakabe use sword drawing techniques with New Shadow Style, and there is enough evidence to suggest New Shadow Style's variant is a bit different. If you look at clues Gege has left about New Shadow Style, it doesn't even have to have anything to do with a barrier technique because it branches off into its own category. But nonetheless, this would allow the user to retain their own curse technique and even leave a domain expansion user vulnerable to attack once a domain is deployed within another's domain. That being said, Yuki explained that these techniques are merely to buy time against a real domain expansion. Next, going into more specific examples, Simple Domain itself has been shown to have a more unique effect on its targets. The only true example of these types of Simple Domain is Mio's use and the Kuchisake Ana Curse's Simple Domain. Both domains enact some type of vow or pact with its targets. Myo forms a barrier only when both challengers agree to sumo match each other, and Anna forms a pact with her target in order for them to answer her question, and then imprints a negative scaled space on the physical environment. Interestingly, it also seems to have this automatic attack function after the pact is fulfilled, yet Toji was able to shrug it off. It was definitely a more unique showcase of what a simple domain can do. And if you are wondering, Toji saying it had an innate domain was actually a mistranslation. This was in fact a simple domain that the curse used. A innate domain is something that is not too often explored within the series, but we can assume that this is a pre-constructed domain that exists within a person's mind. When a sorcerer uses domain expansion, they, in theory, would have to first possess an innate domain themselves in order to realize the environment constructed with their own cursed energy. Some specialized areas like the detention center and the Yosahachi Bridge had an incomplete innate domain manifested within the area continuously. Since it's impossible to continuously expand a domain endowed with a cursed technique, these domains were incomplete. You could say that this is one of the first steps in realizing a domain expansion, but there is a lot that we do not know about innate domains and what really makes it possible. A lesser focused anti-domain countermeasure is a technique called Falling Blossom Emotion, created by the Zenin clan to combat domain expansion. Unlike simple domain, it does not create a domain, but instead shrouds the user in an aura of cursed energy, and the moment the short hit of the domain expansion makes contact, the cursed energy strikes the technique with equal force. This has been shown by Neobito to counter the Death Swarm technique, but was unable to protect Neobito from physical strikes. Ogi Zenin also used Falling Blossom Emotion against Maki, and Ogi offensively uses swordplay to shroud the cursed energy around his weapon and instantly strike anything that it makes contact with. This was ineffective against Dragon Bone, which could accumulate force and cursed energy and eject it against an enemy. Falling Blossom Emotion is quite unique, but it's actually not necessarily considered a barrier technique, much less a domain itself. The variety in many different techniques involving barriers just proves that there is a lot more to it than it may seem. And regarding Kenjaku's statement about domains neutralizing cursed techniques, Mekamaru and Kusakabe canceling cursed techniques, and chapter 171's contradiction about new shadow style and simple domain, please stay tuned because we will be fully debunking all of that in my domain expansion section later in the video. The last ability before moving on to domain expansion is the specialized technique Domain Amplification. This ability is a completely different branch in Jujutsu and only has 3 users, including Jogo, Hanami, and the one who taught them this technique, Kenjaku. Domain Amplification itself is a bit of a mistranslation, as it really should be Domain Envelopment, because in a sense the user is essentially wearing a domain expansion. Jogo uses the kanji ten-en, which means closer to stretch out thinly in Japanese, and in fact ten-en can even mean expansion in certain circumstances. Using amplification is kind of misleading and also inaccurate, since they are not actually amplifying their domain, they are merely wearing it. A closer translation would be domain envelop. This lets them always neutralize cursed techniques, as Gojo was vulnerable to their attacks with domain amplification active. This is Gojo's reaction translated by a skilled Japanese and English translator called Lightning446 on Twitter. Domain amplification. It's the same as New Shadow Simple Domain. In terms of fundamental barrier techniques, if you consider domain expansion as a barrier or prison that captures its target, then domain amplification is water. You engulf yourself only in a liquid. I wonder if it's similar to the feeling of when you first push back against the domain. Your guaranteed hit effect gets weakened, but it will guarantee you'll neutralize the curse technique. With this, even I'm vulnerable to attacks. Lightning's translation is a bit more raw and different, but this explains it perfectly because it's truly like wearing your very own domain expansion. Your shrouded water-like barrier neutralizes cursed techniques it comes into contact with, and notice how the translation used the word neutralize. That's very important with the wording here. It's not cancel, it's not disable, it's not shut off, it's neutralize. This has a lot to do with the domain's overpowering effect as well. Like domain amplification and domain expansion would have to be potent enough to overpower a curse technique. In Gojo's fight with Jogo and Hanami, he proved he could overpower their amplification or their envelopment by strengthening his own curse technique being limitless, and Hanami definitely found that out the hard way. When they use domain amplification on Gojo, there's actually a lot that goes into it, and I even looked for help and questioned a helpful Japanese and English speaking translator, Lightning446 on Twitter, again about it, and the effect of amplification and how chapter 171 explained its sure hit effect. So in that fight, Jogo and Hanami actually had the ability to use an innate technique along with domain amplification and even include a sure hit attack to reach Gojo. However, they had left that domain amplification blank in order to have enough capacity to pour into Gojo's limitless and neutralize it. When Gojo surmised domain amplification and innate techniques couldn't be used at the same time, he just assumed that because they both refrained from including their own curse techniques in amplification. And even when they both did this, they still couldn't completely bypass Gojo's limitless. And this tells us a lot about how curse technique neutralization works within domains. It's like the curse technique is nullified when clashing against a domain's attacks, so it would be rendered ineffective. But that of course depends on the domain's individual potency to overpower said curse technique. There's also something similar Kenjaku did in chapter 208 when he applied anti-gravity using his body as a domain to survive Yuki's black hole. In the fan book, when talking about Hanami, a fan questions if Hanami could materialize tree branches inside a person's heart. Gege says this is impossible because the inside of a body is like a domain and you have to rip it open first. So there is an innate rule that the body is a type of domain, but it's not something a person could normally take advantage of as it's something that's naturally there. So when Kenjaku used his anti-gravity system, he used curse technique lapse and avoided the restrictions on unstable output and activation time by using his own body as a domain. So he isn't creating a barrier, but taking advantage of the natural domain that he already has and funneling that to his curse technique. Essentially, it's like an incomplete domain. So now Kenjaku has the output, the stability, and the activation time of a regular domain, but it only applies to strengthening his anti-gravity system to survive the black hole. This was an on-the-fly maneuver, and I don't imagine Kenjaku had any time to work with, so he had to use his own body for the technique to work. Since Kenjaku is the one who is hinted at being the one who created domain amplification, and amplification can actually include or use a curse technique within its function, it's possible this is similar, but the nature in which Kenjaku used his body makes me think that this is something totally unique that we have never seen before. Not like it's surprising since Kenjaku is like the second best barrier user in the series. Alright, now moving on to the final barrier technique to debunk, domain expansion. Domain expansion is the greatest and most powerful barrier technique a sorcerer can perform and creates a specialized perimeter or separate space entirely manifested from a curse technique, and as a barrier imbued with a curse technique effect. Really, there are only two types of domain expansion: a modern sure kill domain with sure hit techniques, and a non-lethal ancient rule-oriented domain which merely force targets to obey the curse technique's rules inside the barrier. There are also some exceptions like Hakare's Idle Death Gamble, which both has a sure hit but is also harmless, plus incomplete domains and open barrier domains. And with all of these, there are many misconceptions and details that we need to go over. So let's begin cooking, shall we? The first type is a modern sure kill domain, and this is by far the most commonly used domain expansion in the series, and even among old incarnate sorcerers, many also use the sure kill style of domain expansion. These type of domains often have closed barrier walls like a shell and deploys guaranteed hit attacks that will always hit. These domains trap targets inside and gives the user a buff to their own curse technique usage in their prime curse energy environment suiting their own innate technique. An example of a modern sure hit type includes Naoya's Time Cell Moon Palace, which injects film gauges as an attack. Dagon's Horizon of the Captivating Skanda is a modern type that deploys fish shikigami that have a sure hit function, and more recently, Yorozu's Threefold Suffering has a sure hit effect of Perfect Sphere that can crush and erase targets on contact. Techniques deployed in these domain expansions have what I keep mentioning as sure hit. You can call it sure hit, guaranteed hit, sure kill, etc. These techniques will always hit and instantly just appear or attack targets inside the domain expansion. This is why all those anti-domain countermeasures like simple domain focus on neutralizing the sure hit effect of domain expansion. A variation of this modern type also includes open barrier domain expansions like Sukuna and Kenjaku's domains. Both of these have attacks that are sure hit, but instead of creating a separate space, they realize their innate technique on the real physical environment without the need for a barrier wall. There is still a set perimeter, example being Malevolent Shrine has a maximum radius of 200 meters. So anything within the open barrier's effective range is subject to the technique's guaranteed hit effect. Sukuna's domain was quite devastating as certain conditions allowed it to affect cursed energy based things and physical objects to destroy most of Shibuya. And Kenjaku absolutely violated Yuki with his sure hit domain, and even though she had new shadow style simple domain up. So there's also an added bonus that an open domain barrier is exempt from new shadow simple domain or hollow wicker basket's counter because there are no walls to negate, so the weaker simple domain would simply just rip apart. There are also incomplete domains as well, like Megami Fushiguro's domain expansion. This fully realizes the technique, but since the barrier is incomplete, there is no sure hit effect inside this barrier. This gives Megami a unique advantage of trapping Reggie inside an enclosed barrier using the physical structures like the gymnasium and empowering his own Ten Shadows technique to overwhelm him. It was actually worse than a sure hit type because Hollow Wicker Basket would not defend standard attacks. The second type are ancient rule-oriented domain expansions. These domains force targets inside to obey the curse technique's rules. Our only example of this type of domain is Haguruma's deadly sentencing court domain. There is a common misconception that this domain has a sure hit of non-violence or something, but no, there is no sure hit. It's just an innate effect that this domain has. There's even a binding vow that requires an explanation of the rules. Everything about this domain forces the target to obey the curse technique's rules, and in Haguruma's, it's non-violence and the explanation of a court with a trial. Unlike Haguruma's, Hakari's domain does have a sure hit, so it is technically a modern type, but shares a similarity in that it is non-lethal and only buffs the user after the domain is dispelled. Now we will be breaking down some specifics involving these domains, and perhaps the biggest retcon is Kenjaku's statement in chapter 82 when he says, "A domain neutralizes all curse techniques. Once trapped inside a domain, even the great Gojo cannot avoid being hit." Now initially it is very easy to assume that a domain expansion would cancel or shut off an opponent's curse technique inside a true domain barrier. After all, in most cases, it's either unclear whether a curse technique is being used, or the domain is incomplete or being contested against, like examples being Gojo, Reggie, Nanami, and Neobito are all using their own curse techniques under these specific circumstances. But neutralize also means to render something ineffective, so a domain user would be able to nullify and bypass an enemy curse technique depending on the potency of the domain expansion. Let's look at Gojo versus Jogo for instance. This is actually the fight referenced in context with Kenjaku's statement, so it's the best example to use here. Something to keep in mind though is that their fight was used to explain domain expansion, used how to defend against domains, how to counter domains, and explain the sure hit effect. However, the fan book explains that Jogo never actually used his true sure hit attack in the domain and merely threw a standard test meteor attack. It's very confusing actually because the only instance where the sure hit is explained, Jogo was not actually using his sure hit. However, Gojo still says curse techniques deployed in the domain will always hit. So Gege really just tried his best to make this as confusing as possible really, but we can actually assume that it's not the sure hit from the fan book's information. Regardless though, Kenjaku's quote still stands, and Jogo's words here are key. Jogo says, "Your infinity. If we're here in my more potent domain, my Jujutsu will reach you now, correct?" Jogo is specifically worried about Gojo's infinity and worried if his attacks will reach him. That's why he deployed a test meteor. If infinity was shut off, why would Jogo worry the attack would reach? And how could Gojo use domain expansion if his curse technique was forced off? There is a bit of a controversy whether Gojo defended himself and Yuji with either cursed energy or with infinity. Gojo himself explains you can defend against the sure hit of the domain with Jujutsu. This term can of course mean cursed energy reinforcement or output, it can mean anti-domain countermeasures, and it can mean cursed techniques. It's a more general term. Even the anime blatantly says Gojo is using a cursed technique here. Now I know it doesn't really make sense why Yuji feels the heat with infinity active. The fanbook kind of leaves it open to how Yuji was okay within the heat of that domain, albeit Gojo, albeit Sukuna, or his own physical toughness. The heat itself is a kind of debuff effect as the fanbook explains. But Jogo specifically mentions his domain is more potent, it's more dense, so Gojo's infinity is like it's being nullified within an enemy territory. Further proof of this is how domain amplification is used against Gojo in Shibuya. He explains that with domain amplification, he is now vulnerable to their attacks, and they can neutralize his curse technique. Notice how it never cancelled or stopped infinity, but it started to bypass it. Jogo and Hanami focused their amplification purely on the domain aspect and voided their own innate techniques so that they can pour into limitless, and Gojo responded by strengthening his own curse technique and countering their amplification. This confirms that there is a sort of power struggle where domain expansion and domain amplification would have to be strong enough to overpower a curse technique. It's never actually been shown or said to turn off a curse technique itself. So in terms of Kenjaku's statement about curse technique neutralization within domains, a sorcerer can still use their innate technique in a domain. I mean, Sukuna used Megami's 10 Shadows technique in Yorozu's full complete domain, no problem. And Gojo, Nanami, and Naobito used their curse technique as well. So when a curse technique is neutralized, that would mean the domain would have the ability to overpower the curse technique, or it would nullify it and always be able to reach the user. There's also the case of Mechamaru damaging Mahito's soul in the evening festival battle. Mechamaru possessed the new Shadow Style Simple Domain technique imbued into specialized domain capsules. Muda used his technique and was able to discharge and directly hit Mahito using this capsule and negate his Idol Transfiguration technique by harming Mahito's soul itself. Since it's confirmed Simple Domain does not cancel curse techniques themselves, how did Muda damage Mahito's soul? Well, Kenjaku made an interesting quote: if another domain is activated inside a domain, even the caster of the first domain, Mahito, will be vulnerable. Since we understand the body is like a domain and it can only be infiltrated once it's torn open, then it makes sense why the new Shadow Style's discharge was able to pierce Mahito's body and bypass his curse technique, therefore damage his vulnerable soul. The second time Mahito faked his death and exploded on purpose, but the first time he was hit by that Simple Domain capsule, he took real damage from New Shadow's Simple Domain. Something that's not really clear is how Kusakabe used his form of New Shadow Style to actually negate and deflect Kenjaku's maximum Uzumaki. Now that is on something else. Chapter 171 stated Hollow Wicker Basket and Simple Domain could not neutralize curse techniques themselves, but what about New Shadow Style just by itself? It's different than barrier techniques. The only evidence I could find was that Gojo compared domain amplification to New Shadow's Simple Domain, right? So there has to be some sort of correlation to how it could deflect and bypass the curse technique. There are some inconsistencies getting into it, but only time will tell as to what New Shadow Style truly is. Not all sorcerers use it the same way. So really do not be surprised when Miwa just starts deflecting attacks she got no business deflecting. Just keep a close eye on this monster. She might just surprise you and pop off toward the end of the series. Our final topic of this video is a domain expansion clash, the counterpull effect and the compatibility effect. It's very interesting how much goes into domain battles. Gojo said when multiple domains are expanded at the same time, the more polished one will reign supreme. As a side note, it can depend on compatibility and cursed energy. We've already seen some evidence that the potency and density of a domain expansion would play a huge effect on the domain tug of war. We've only ever saw domain expansions clash on a few occasions, but never actually saw a true domain battle on equal footing. Never. In the events that we've seen domains clash, like Megumi versus Dagon's domain battle, something that happens is that the sure hit of both domains become void and cancel each other out. Something else that can occur is that the technique potential for both the users of the domains will increase dramatically. 120% is the raw estimate for how much the potential grows. So naturally, a fighter is stronger within their own domain, since they get some sort of buff. In Dagon's battle, we saw how much stronger he was with Death Swarm, and he still had a clear advantage. Megumi's domain clash may have been a ploy to escape, but it still emphasized that there is a sort of tug-of-war effect when it comes to domain battle. In Sendai, Yuta, Ryu, and Uro had a three-way domain expansion clash. It seems the three were able to form a semi-compatible barrier at first, and even had their sure hits cancel each other out. However, due to the complexity and different conditions internally and externally in the barriers, along with Kuro Urushi's interference, the three-way domain expansion barrier collapsed, so we never really got to see domains of similar strength and effect clash. Considering what we do know what takes place after the curse techniques cancel out, it's probably a similar scenario like Dagon, to where he can fight, deploy techniques, and keep his barrier strong at the same time. So we can assume a domain struggle would be very dependent on cursed energy and compatibility, like Gojo mentioned in chapter 15. Dagon said he needed to crush Megumi's domain to regain his sure hit. So again, it would come down to a domain expansion's potency and density to overpower the enemy territory. Of course, actively trying to kill the enemy domain caster, even without the sure hit, is also effective, and it's the most likely outcome of a domain clash. There is also the matter of a domain's activation time and guaranteed hit effectiveness. We have seen Gojo and Mahito activate their sure hit type domains within 0.2 seconds in order to dampen their curse technique effect by a specific time activation. So in essence, the domain would hit targets and activate the curse technique all within 0.2 seconds, which does not give opponents any time at all to react or even use their own domain expansion, as the user's domain has already run its course. Mahito specifically used this to avoid Sukuna touching his soul, and Gojo used this to mitigate the effects of Limitless Void on civilians. The activation time is even stronger in Hikari's domain expansion. Hikari's domain has an activation time even faster than Mahito, so it's even less than 0.2 seconds. This makes the domain and curse technique activation near instantaneous. The kanji used in this chapter 187 translates as strong in pushing, or it is strong against tug of war. Both the Viz and TCB scans failed to mention this statement in context with domain expansion battles. So the English translations use words like forceful or aggressive in relation to the curse technique activation, but it only makes sense if these words are used in context with domain expansion's tug of war. Now, Hikari's domain has a harmless sure hit effect. However, as a trade-off, his activation time is near instantaneous, and he receives a boost in his domain expansion counterpull. Not that his domain couldn't be overpowered in the first place, but if Hikari deployed his domain first, the opponent has no real way to react or counter his harmless sure hit. Shout out again to Japanese translator Lightning446 for pointing this detail out. They are goated at this video, and they even expressed the theory that since Hikari is resistant in a tug of war, he would be able to keep rolling for a jackpot. They also mentioned if Hikari's sure hit were to fail against something like a precasted simple domain or an opponent with zero cursed energy like Maki or Toji, then his domain expansion would be less effective, as revealing the curse technique gives a buff to the caster, especially since the sure hit itself is the info reveal. Though domain expansion does have its drawbacks, the most obvious being that once a domain is casted after it is dispelled, the user's curse technique begins to burn out and not work properly. This is an effect that even Gojo Satoru deals with. However, Gojo is the only sorcerer who can expand his domain expansion multiple times a day. This is mainly because Gojo's cursed energy never runs out due to the 6 eyes. Domain expansion also uses a substantial amount of cursed energy, so once the barrier is created, it's really not likely a sorcerer will make another domain if his first one is already dispelled. But this is only in context with a modern sure kill type domains, and these are much harder to perform, but a domain like Hikari's can be used back to back, as its effects are harmless, and he uses the cursed energy left from his jackpot mode to deploy another domain. And in another case with Haguruma, his domain is also harmless, and it could be expanded multiple times a day according to the retrial Yuji proposed in their fight. In Hagurama's case, it's more like his domain expansion flow isn't dependent on him, the caster, but on the verdict itself, hence the retrial. Domain expansion is also not able to apply the sure hit effect to Maki or Toji because they possess no cursed energy at all. Domains that create a separate space are unable to include physical objects like buildings, and it just phases through. So naturally, Maki and Toji are not included in those barriers, and they can freely enter or exit the domain. Unless they consent to the domain's conditions, they cannot be trapped. Even if they are within the domain, the sure hit is unable to recognize them. More or less, if you fight Maki and Toji in a domain, it'd be back to square one, though you would have a buffed technique. On the other hand, Sukuna's malevolent shrine can 100% kill them because it includes physical structures both with and without cursed energy specifically. It's unknown if Kenjaku's can do the same since it also exists in the physical world, and it seems to crush the area around Yuki when he uses it, but the inanimate object targeting was specific to Sukuna. Lastly, there's not necessarily a way to tell that a domain expansion is more refined than another domain. Some sorcerers have domains that can move coordinates, domains that are more dense, and even domains that are akin to a divine masterpiece with an open barrier design. When it comes to what domain will win, it really comes down to multiple factors like cursed energy and compatibility. Of course, two of the best domain users in the series, Kenjaku and Sukuna, use open domains, which even Lord Tengen found it impressive, and Tengen is the best barrier user in the series. So it's easy to assume that open barriers are the next level or they are better, but since it is possible for those barriers to clash with closed ones, as hinted by Kenjaku when he taunted Yuki, it's probably not so cut and dry to assume that even a divine technique would be more refined. There's nothing really definitive to rely on. Open domains themselves counter simple domain and affect the real environment, so there are less options to defend against it other than deploying your very own domain expansion. A domain's individual potency could mean how effective it is inside the barrier. In a domain clash, the density of a domain and the influence of the technique could play a huge factor in how long a given barrier lasts. Like say, Yorozu's domain clash with Naoya's. Which technique is more potent? Which ability is more refined? Who has more cursed energy? Or say, Kenjaku's domain expansion clash with Jogo's domain. Hell, even just imagine Kenjaku's domain against Sukuna's domain. Kenjaku's technically a better domain user from what we've heard. Does that mean he wins a domain battle? No, it doesn't. We can only guess, but you'd have to consider how refined, how potent, how powerful their sure hit and innate domains are to even make a conclusion, and even then it's just an estimation. I really couldn't even say how an ancient domain can clash with a modern domain. Like sure hit versus rule oriented, that is way too complicated. And again, that would just have to depend on how refined and influential each barrier's counterpull is, to which we have way too little information on to even go off of that. Honestly, we just need to see just one true domain clash, and it would tell us so much about how these domain battles play out. So hopefully by the end of the series, we will have an answer to that. So throughout this video, we have gone over different types of domains, how domains function, how the sure hit works, and how domain expansions clash. I made this video in the hope to have a better understanding of domains moving forward and to correct even things that I have gotten wrong in past videos. There is a lot to consider when you read different translations and how you interpret certain scenarios and words. It's just good to use context and information from what we already know to make a good conclusion. There are definitely some nuanced things like new shadow style and the domain of the body, how refined a domain is, that is just way too unclear. But for the most part, this was insanely fun to go over, and definitely moving forward, I'll consider these topics in future JJK battles. I hope this vid gives you brothers just some more appreciation and insight into the complexity of domains, and even to understand it just a little bit more. Remember to share your thoughts below. You awesome brothers take care. This has been Enemy Stand User, and I'll see you awesome guys in the next one. Bye bye.